Very, very excited to have Chelsey Slack with us for this keynote, Deputy Head of the Cyber Defense Section at NATO, as her background suggests. So yeah, Chelsey, I'll give you the floor.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Patricia, as well as to all of the organizers for this opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. It's really an honor to be a part of such a diverse and enriching conversation. An article from the Foreign Affairs Journal in the spring of last year observed that the new great power competition won't necessarily take place on battlefields or in boardrooms. It will happen on smartphones, computers, and other connected devices, and on the digital infrastructure that supports them. With this in mind, over the next few minutes, I'd like to talk to you about how NATO and its 30 allies are tackling the topic of cyberspace, both in terms of the challenges, but also the opportunities that it provides. And I'd like to do this by looking at three main questions and reflecting on them. The first question is, what is the nature of cyberspace and the strategic challenge that it poses? The second question, how has a political military alliance like NATO tackled this challenge over the last few years? And thirdly, how does an organization like NATO bring together countries and other actors to cooperate on cyber issues? So, to cyberspace then. What is the nature of this domain? As the NATO Secretary General has observed, nowhere is the fog of war thicker than it is in cyberspace. Cyberspace is a contested environment. NATO and NATO allies have recognized that cyber threats to the security of the alliance are complex, destructive, coercive, and are becoming ever more frequent. Threat actors increasingly seek to destabilize by employing malicious cyber activities and campaigns below the threshold of an armed attack. It is important to see cyberspace for what it is. Unlike the other domains, the more traditional ones of air, land, and sea, cyberspace is a domain that is always on. This often challenges our thinking as we seek familiarity in drawing parallels with the more conventional domains, while we try to understand the cyber domain for what it is in and of itself. For one thing, cyberspace is multi-stakeholder in nature, both with state, non-state actors, public, private, civilian, military. When it comes to threat actors, they're motivated for a number of different reasons, be them political, economic, financial, or ideological. You've all seen media headlines of global cyber incidents targeting democratic processes, as well as critical infrastructure, including the healthcare sector during the global pandemic. And we see increasingly the use of cyber tools during crises and in military operations. There is also discussion around supply chain issues following the SolarWinds incident and the Microsoft Exchange server compromises over the past year. Not to mention ransomware incidents that increasingly disrupt our critical infrastructures, such as pipelines. But it's not only the physical risk that we're talking about, and that's the risk of malicious cyber activities targeting critical infrastructures. But we also have to be mindful of cyber-enabled threats, here more targeting the cognitive space through, for example, disinformation campaigns. Compounding this complexity of the intermixing of physical virtual worlds is, of course, new and emerging disruptive technologies, including artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, that will change the nature of this space even further. So, cyberspace is a unique domain. It requires us to align our strategies to its specificities. And the threat environment is dynamic, with many different actors operating for different motivations, which means that we need to continue to enhance our defenses. And we must do this by working together. This brings me then to my second question. How has a political military alliance like NATO tackled this challenge over the past few years? NATO is a political military alliance. It is an alliance of values, and it stands for the collective defense of its 30 members, its 30 allies, protecting nearly 1 billion citizens. At its core is the notion of collective defense. An attack on one member is an attack on all. While these principles have remained constant for over nearly 75 years, NATO has evolved to tackle these challenges, including in cyberspace. And I'd like to reflect over the last 2 decades in particular about the journey that NATO has been on in this regard. It started really in 2002 with the recognition that we need to protect our systems, our missions and operations from cyber threats. Of course, the events in Estonia in 2007, where we saw widespread cyber tools used to achieve political objectives, to disrupt government services, even banking sector, access for citizens to use these daily services. Arguably, that was the first instance where we saw this seemingly technical means, this technical tool, to achieve political objectives. This spurred NATO's thinking into developing its first cyber defense strategy in 2008, which also saw the conflict in Georgia, where cyber tools were deployed alongside more conventional military capability in the conflict there. This further spurred thinking as to the strategic nature then of these cyber threats. And in 2010, when the Alliance adopted its current strategic concept, and work is underway to develop a new strategic concept next year, but this strategic concept in 2010 recognized for the first time that cyber threats could reach a threshold that would threaten Euro-Atlantic security, peace, prosperity, and stability. Of course, we saw the events in Ukraine in 2014, which saw then this notion of hybrid campaigns take effect. And in 2014, NATO adopted its former, most recent cyber defense policy from 2014, where for the first time, cyber defense was recognized as part of NATO's core task of collective defense. So that's about as political as it gets. In the years that followed, once again, looking at the cyber threat landscape and geopolitical developments, NATO has recognized cyber as an operational domain, as a domain of military activity. And we've also been doing thinking, recognizing that a lot of the malicious activity that we see in cyberspace often falls below the threshold of armed conflict. So how do we develop NATO's toolbox to respond to that? More recently, just a few months ago, NATO allies adopted the latest comprehensive cyber defense policy, which I'll speak to in a moment. But once again, this solidifies our thinking around how this domain has developed over the last 2 decades, some of the geopolitical events that we've seen, how the threat landscape has developed, and how our policy responses and approaches needed to mature as well. Once again, the bottom line is that cyber has gone from being viewed purely as a technical issue to now being part and parcel of NATO's strategic reality. And with this journey in mind, I'd now like to look at what we're focusing on here, that allies can achieve together through a platform such as NATO, but also what they're doing nationally, given that NATO is a collection of its 30 allies. So together, allies are boosting NATO's capacity as a collective defense organization. I mentioned that allies have recognized that cyber threats can reach a threshold that threatens our security, and they've recognized cyber defense as part of NATO's core task of collective defense. So this means that a cyber attack could be grounds to invoke Article 5 of NATO's founding treaty. This decision was balanced with the recognition that international law also applies in cyberspace. So there are rules that govern this space, and any responses would be taken in accordance with them. At the past summit in June, NATO allies agreed on the latest cyber defense policy. This was the first one to be updated in 7 years. And it recognizes that cyberspace is contested at all times. And so we must be ready at all times to actively deter, defend against, and counter threats and actors that we face. For this, we need political resolve, technical capabilities, military planning in place to keep our systems, our economies, our societies and ways of life secure. And we're looking at leveraging different responses, different instruments of state power to do this, be it political, diplomatic, economic, or military responses. And NATO is a platform for political consultation among allies who wish to share concerns about malicious cyber activities, as well as consider possible collective responses together. Now, allies are also working individually to build their own resilience. The alliance is only as strong as its weakest link, and so allies are strengthening their cyber defenses at the national level to protect their critical infrastructures, their supply chains, and to reduce vulnerabilities. One main tool that allies are using to do this is what we call the Cyber Defense Pledge. And this was an instrument that heads of state and government approved in 2016. And it has 7 key objectives for allies nationally when it comes to enhancing their own cyber resilience. Everything from resourcing cyber defense, how they're structured nationally, coordination, strategies, how education and training is done, awareness, partnerships with industry, the whole range. And now 5 years into its implementation, there are 2 main areas where we feel that tools like the Cyber Defense Pledge have been really helpful. The first is that it provides an opportunity to galvanize national investment on cyber defense. In an era where resources are scarce and there are several priorities to budget for, it's often challenging to resource cyber defense, given it's less tangible in many ways. And it's only when something goes wrong do you really realize then just how much it enables other systems and infrastructures. So the Cyber Defense Pledge is a good tool for enhancing the profile of cyber defense and the need to invest in it, also at the political level. The second main benefit of the Cyber Defense Pledge is that it cultivates cooperation among different stakeholders across governments. So not traditionally just the security and defense sector, but looking really across the whole government, ministries of health and education, different awareness programs, training and education, making sure systems are secure in the healthcare sector. So viewing cyber and mainstreaming cyber aspects into this whole government approach. When it comes to integrated approaches, this brings me to my third and final question. How does an organization like NATO bring together countries to cooperate on cyber issues? NATO has an important and unique role to play in advancing security, peace, and stability at a time when technology is accelerating changes to our strategic environment. And we cannot do this alone. NATO works with more than 40 different partner countries as part of its partner network. This is tailored engagement based on shared values and common approaches to cyber defense. And I was asked to share a few examples of how NATO is working with key partners such as Switzerland. In just a couple of weeks, NATO's flagship cyber defense exercise, Cyber Coalition, will take place in Estonia. And we're very pleased that Switzerland is involved in this. Cyber Coalition brings more than 1,000 cyber defenders from across the alliance and our partners together to tackle not only technical challenges, but also figure out how to collaborate and cooperate. Is the right network in place, the right ways to share information, which is so key in having the best situational awareness possible to be able to respond to cyber threats. So we're very pleased that Switzerland will be taking part in Cyber Coalition exercise. Another example of our cooperation is through information sharing. We have at NATO a malware information sharing platform, and Switzerland is part of this multinational smart defense project. And really, this platform is ways for allies and partners to enhance, once again, their situational awareness, by sharing indicators of compromise, other technical details that make it easier for cyber defenders to have a better awareness of the threat and put in place measures to respond. We value our partnership with Switzerland on cyber issues, recognizing cyber is a shared space and requires our shared responsibility. More broadly, we're also working with the European Union, including through a dedicated technical arrangement between the cyber defenders of the two organizations to share actionable information. And as defense requires a broader number of stakeholders around the table than in the past, militaries and armed forces rely on civilian critical infrastructure to carry out their missions and operations. So we need partnerships, including with industry and academia, who are often the innovators and the operators of these networks. NATO has a dedicated NATO industry cyber partnership, which helps us also to leverage innovation, share information, understand better different technological trends and where the markets are going, but also in turn helps the private sector understand what requirements organizations like NATO or governments might be looking to in the future. We're also doing quite a bit of work on emerging and disruptive technologies. NATO's first artificial intelligence strategy with principles for safe and responsible use of data was recently agreed at our defense ministerial a couple of weeks ago. So my colleagues are working very hard in the area of innovation, emerging disruptive technologies, to once again use NATO as this platform to harness innovation and work closely with the private sector. Now, in addition to being more prepared to address cyber incidents and crises, and working with our partners to this end, NATO also welcomes efforts to prevent these incidents and crises from happening in the first place. NATO itself does not set norms in cyberspace, but we support such efforts to promote stability in cyberspace and reduce the risk of conflict. NATO is an alliance of values committed to the principles of individual liberty, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And these values underpin the way that we use technology. So this means standing up for these values and the rules-based international order. Allies are committed to promoting a free, open, peaceful, and secure cyberspace. For example, allies have condemned the malicious cyber activities that targeted sectors that were critical for responding to the global pandemic. Earlier this year, they also condemned the widespread SolarWinds hack. And most recently in July, just a month after adopting a new cyber defense policy, allies issued a statement condemning malicious cyber activities, including the Microsoft Exchange server compromise. NATO issued this statement of solidarity alongside individual allies, as well as several partner countries and other international organizations, such as the European Union. So this is a good example of actions taken to call out unacceptable behavior, because there are rules that govern cyberspace, and we need to uphold them. NATO leaders will come together for their summit in Madrid next year, where they expect to agree on a new strategic concept for the alliance. We've been on an important journey the last 2 decades as NATO's approach to cyber defense has developed and as it's matured. What was once viewed purely as a technical issue, with the standing up of NATO's first capabilities in 2002, cyber defense is now part and parcel of NATO's broader approach to deterrence and defense, moving into 2022. Looking to the future, cyberspace and the emerging and disruptive technologies that it enables will be at the core of strategic competition among states. This shared challenge requires our collective resolve, and NATO's doing its part, but there's much more to be done. It is clear that as an environment, as a domain that is always on, so too must be our efforts to engage. And conversations like the one we've been having today, as part of this event, contribute to that. So I'd like to thank you once again for this opportunity to be a part of the important discussion today. And I look forward to taking any questions. Thank you. Back to you, Patricia.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the talk. There have been a number of questions posted in the Q&A section. One I was pinged directly, so I'm just going to start with that one. And everyone who's listening, feel free to post further questions. So one was specifically about what does NATO do to support and promote women in cyber?
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. Well, as a start, we're very delighted to be supporting this event today, bringing together a range of different experts from across different sectors, different disciplines. We also, in terms of our own work, do a lot when it comes to trying to promote diversity in our hiring practices, but also looking at the expertise and the skill sets that are required. As we know, in cybersecurity, there is a shortage of expertise and the need for training and education and experts in this field. And so actually one of the focus areas as part of our Cyber Defense Pledge, this tool to enhance allied resilience, a couple of years ago, we looked specifically at education and training, including recruitment, retention, trying to look at national best practice in this area from across the 30 allies to help all allies deal with this challenge. So not just at NATO, but also increasingly within allies. And several innovative approaches, be it through student competitions or training programs, mentoring programs, were thoughtful as in terms of good practice in this space. So I think events like this, conversations like this, and our involvement, but also on a day-to-day basis, the working of our experts in talking to civil society, academia, industry, other governments, and once again using NATO as this platform to share good practice across the 30 allies with our partners, industry and academia, is one way that we're helping to contribute to this challenge.
Thanks, and I think you kind of... Ooh. Okay. I think you kind of touched upon another question that was asked, which is how does NATO find their cyber talent? So I know that that's a tricky one, but I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
Yes, indeed. So there are several different ways, but as I mentioned, it is a continuous challenge. Also, as you're all aware too, one of the ways is through our NATO internship program, which is a great way of getting professionals at the beginning of their career or those making a change in their career to come into the alliance. They might have worked in different sectors, and they come and bring their knowledge. So that is one way of recruiting this talent. There are different agencies across NATO as well that have other approaches, be it kind of career days or more focused events, challenges, and events focused on specific subject matter areas or different experts. But I would say the NATO internship program is one way of attracting this talent, in addition to our recruitment more generally, which looks at the types of cyber expertise that are required and then how we can go about filling them with experts.
Thank you. I see Cornelia asked a question as well, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you that one. And it is, what is the one thing that most inspires and drives you in your role?
Thank you, Cornelia. I think when I first arrived at NATO as someone who always wanted to work in this diplomatic environment, this multinational environment, that's really what I find quite inspiring and also quite rewarding. You have an organization, a platform of 30 different countries, each with their national viewpoints, that decide to come and sit at this table at the North Atlantic Council and make decisions, discuss issues, consult, and ultimately take those ideas and put them into practice. And so working as part of the international staff in support of those allied negotiations, one of the most inspiring things is really to look at how those different pieces of the puzzle come together to discuss the different issues and national approaches, and to then forge that consensus so that when NATO agrees on a policy, agrees on a strategy or a communique, that really means something, because it is 30 NATO allies agreeing word for word to that piece of work. So I think that is one of the most inspiring things, this multilateral environment, countries coming together, bringing their national approaches, and then seeing what can be done collectively in order to advance shared security interests.
Thanks. Maybe shifting gears a little bit more towards cyber itself. One of the questions was, what is currently the biggest cyber threat that NATO faces?
Thank you for the question. Well, as I mentioned, there are a number of different cyber threats that can range from different actors and for a number of different reasons. So I think regardless of the threat or the specific threat actor, what is important is the work that we do to understand the threat environment, to understand the motivations of different actors, but then importantly, to have that shared situational awareness and to use NATO as a platform where countries, where partners, industry, academia can come and share that information so that we have the different pieces of the pie, of the puzzle, so to speak, that then allow us to make decisions on that information that we have, pooling it all together. So regardless of the threat, really looking at how we can use NATO as a platform to understand the environment and then to tailor our responses. As I mentioned, some of the responses might be collective, should allies decide to do that, through statements, through more diplomatic activities. Other responses might be more individual in nature, through allies, the work that they do nationally to enhance their resilience, or through law enforcement activities, or their own political initiatives. So regardless of the threat, unfortunately, the threat landscape is rapidly evolving. We need to be vigilant. That's why we're focusing on our defenses, developing our resilience, and doing this within the NATO context, using it as a means to enhance resilience collectively.
Thank you for that. There's a question that seems to be a bit more on the personal side. So from Pascal asking, what do you do at home to protect yourself against cyber threats?
That's a great question, Pascal, because I think it really works to the fundamentals, of cybersecurity. Often we have very complex debates around the strategic nature and around offensive cyber and developing capabilities, but really a lot of it comes down to the fundamentals, which is kind of basic cyber hygiene and the measures that can be taken. So it doesn't often attract the headlines, yet often a lot of these events are the result of misconfigurations or passwords or things. So I would say definitely looking at the basics of your own personal security, but then realizing that it can be linked to other areas, to other systems is quite important. But really looking at the fundamentals, that basic cyber hygiene. And I think you've been seeing a lot of work done around awareness programs for not only the common public, but also looking into education at the youngest age. How do we interact with technology? How do we build that awareness and those good security practices that will then follow us throughout our careers and our personal lives. But back to the basics and getting the fundamentals right, even if it can be challenging.
Good place to start. Just maybe one last question, since we have 1 minute left. It's a bit cheeky. I don't know if you can actually give an answer, but let's try. It got a few likes as well, so this is why I'd like to ask. The question is, how do you see Switzerland's cyber defense in comparison with other countries?
Well, as I said, Switzerland is a valued partner of NATO on cyber defense issues. At the political level, Switzerland has come to brief on some of their national developments, be it standing up cybersecurity centers or the work that's going on in the armed forces. I think there is that shared recognition of the need to enhance resilience and to deepen partnerships. And so we're very pleased that Switzerland has been sharing some of its good practice as well. I mentioned the importance of exercising. That's really important when it comes to helping countries understand the way that they share information, not only nationally within the interagency, which we know can be challenging, but also with partners. So Cyber Coalition is a great occasion for testing those ways of sharing information and the day-to-day practices that we might take for granted, but that in an event, and especially when you're trying to cooperate internationally, really make a difference. And last but not least, on the information sharing piece is quite important, and we appreciate Switzerland's contribution in that respect as well, and look forward to the partnership continuing.
Thanks. I know we went above. Do you have 1 more minute? There's one last question there's not one last question. There's a few, but there's one that I would like to ask if you have a second. From Pascal again, the question is IoT on NATO's risk landscape?
So looking at kind of the future technological well, not only the future, but the present one, absolutely. We need to be looking at managing risk across all different platforms. I mentioned the work we're doing not only in emerging disruptive technologies, but looking towards the future and innovation and what might be heading our way. But given this increasingly digitized and connected environment, we need to be conscious of all of the access points and the connectivity that we have, and be able to manage that risk and to protect and defend against those risks should they come our way.
Perfect. Thank you so much. There are a few others, but I think we've already gone above, and it's evening, so I think we'll leave it at that. Perhaps for a next Women in Cyber Day, when we'd be happy to have you back, and then we can have more questions for you. So thank you very much, Chelsey.